Hello everyone, welcome back. This is S.C. Coleman, author. In this video we're going to be talking about two, essentially speaking, separate elements. The first is part of, anyway, the mission to change military in concept, designation, and everything to quote-unquote law enforcement. This is part of, essentially speaking, the enemy's plan to establish a Earth or global complete military occupation for private interests under the moniker law enforcement. As I've stipulated in past videos, this means wholly replacing all military components with subcontracted security guards wearing badges and letters and titles and those types of things. It also means the complete and utter obliteration of anyone who has ever taken an oath of allegiance to the U.S. Constitution. So you get rid, get out, kill, essentially, or otherwise dispose of any military personnel or people, and you replace them with subcontracted security guards. Those subcontracted security guards will essentially be wearing the uniforms of police, sheriffs, traffic cops, so-called immigration, customs, tax revenue, all the different things you can think of. But they will, effectively speaking, be an occupying force with military equipment and weapons, but no actual militaries across the globe will be left in their capacity. Now, the first document we're going to look at that has to do with that transition period is a memorandum of understanding between the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, DHS, and the U.S. Department of Defense, DoD, Naval Station Guantanamo Bay. This is transitioning Naval Station Guantanamo Bay into the hands of the Department of Homeland Security. And as always with these processes, they always start at one position with the motive to get over here. It is a heavily established pattern. It's well understood that whatever these people do, they are always and forever going to be lying and will never, ever, ever say what their ultimate objective is. That has to be analyzed and understood through research, logic, and reasoning, and of course comprehension, which you can't do if you're constantly criticizing everything. So this stipulates considered high threat for housing at Camp 6 and a JTF Building 6. So I wonder if the JTF Building 6 has something to do with Camp 6. Within 15 days from the effective date of this MOU, the parties will agree to standards for detention under DHS/ICE legal custody to be set forth in addendum to this MOU. So there's a couple things to understand here, which we'll get into the second one. They start out with the umbrella cover, this is for foreigners. You don't need to worry about it. This is about immigration and customs enforcement. It has nothing to do with anyone here. First of all, the immigration and customs enforcement system that we have today is run by foreigners to protect themselves by controlling the mechanism with which individuals are punished for the alleged crime of existing in an area they're not allowed to be in. However, we have to understand that the overall point is that that is a cover story, and the actual motive and objective is to first establish control over Naval Station Guantanamo Bay to use as a prison, with the ultimate objective of putting U.S. citizens, Americans, and just basically anybody else that they want to there under the moniker law enforcement. and we'll understand that in the next document. We will provide an appropriate ratio of DHS/ICE officers to NSGB IAs as mutually determined between the parties to achieve the responsibilities indicated in this memorandum, and at a minimum will provide at least 2 DHS/ICE law enforcement officers or contractors in accordance with DHS/ICE standard operating procedures at Camp 6 detention facility on a 24/7 basis, and will provide an appropriate number of DHS/ICE law enforcement officers and interior security in accordance with DHS/ICE standard operating procedures at the hard-sized Migrant Operations Center facility on the leeward side on a 24/7 basis, depending on the size of the NSGBIA population. Understands DoD will use DoD rules for the use of force unless the parties agree to another standard. Applicable and agreed upon rules for the use of force will be shared between the parties to ensure ICE/DHS awareness of DoD operational rules. Due to security and legal concerns, there will be no press access to Camp 6. Will determine the appropriate level of access by NSGB IAs to legal representation, including when, to whom, and under what circumstances such access is granted in consultation with the JTF SG commander and taking into account NSGB physical security protocols. So like I said, they're transitioning it, and it's very obvious that the individual writing this is coming from the perspective that they control the regulations, the standards, and the way in which this area is operated. Effectively speaking, they do administer and control this place. Will provide perimeter security and facility access for/security. Obviously, anybody can do that, is in control of the area. Now, there's all of the points of contact are blanked out, they're redacted. You have the Deputy Undersecretary, DHS Office of Strategic Policy and Planning, or Plans, and of course that's going to be United Nations representative. Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Border and Immigration Policy, same goes. DHS Office of Strategy and Policy and Plans. These are, of course, all going to be attorneys. Duties of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and Hemispheric Affairs. That's garbage. Acting Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and Hemispheric Affairs. And this stuff is ridiculous. And there's other sections here that are redacted. You can see that. High threat is a security category determined by DHS and is synonymous with other terms such as maximum security and high risk. And we see that word usage a lot when it comes to U.S. persons, especially in context to the idea and concept of owning a firearm is indicative of criminal intent, mental instability, and most importantly, high-risk behavior. This MOU expires on March 15th, 2026. Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, Troy D. Edgar. U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Robert G. Salesis, performing duties of the Deputy Secretary of Defense. So this is signed by someone performing the duties of the Deputy Secretary of Defense. Well, isn't that nice? This is dated 7th March 2025 in both sections. And this next document, Memorandum for Commander United States Cyber Command, Attention Acquisitions Executive. Commander United States Special Operations Command, Attention Acquisition Executive. Commander United States Transportation Command, Attention Acquisition Executive. Well, that totally sounds normal, right? No, it doesn't. That's interesting to see those acquisition executives with an alleged military components. That's not a military title at all. Those are obviously civilians. Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army, Procurement. Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Procurement. Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, Contracting. Directors of defense agencies and directors of DoD field activities. These are all going to be attorneys. Probably. Either way, they're operating under the cover of military so that the military personnel can take the fall for what they're planning here. Defense Industrial Base Contract Considerations. The Defense Industrial Base, DIB, is identified as a critical infrastructure sector by the Department of Homeland Security, memorandum dated March 19, 2020, and amplified in the attached Undersecretary of Defense Acquisition and Sustainment Memorandum to the Industrial Base dated March 20, 2020. DHS defines the essential critical infrastructure workforce to include personnel working for companies and their subcontractors who perform under contract to the Department of Defense, providing materials and services to the Department of Defense, and government-owned contractor-operated and government-owned government-operated facilities. So they came up with that stupid critical personnel crap that we had during 2020. No surprise there at all. And of course, it's always got a hand of foreign hand from Europe. Points of contact for this member are Mr. Scott Callisti and Jeff Grover. Listed phone numbers. Digitally signed by a Kim Harrington, Acting Principal Director, Defense Pricing and Contracting. So that's, of course, the appropriate individual to sign that, right? No, it's not. Just more bogus garbage. As long as it looks fine, then, who cares? Just do what we want. Now we get into the concept of why they really want Guantanamo Bay. DoD Anti-Terrorism Program Support to Force Protection. June 11th, 2025. Yeah, support. That's another cover term. The DoD Anti-Terrorism, or AT program, Support to Force Protection, FP. This issuance, DoD personnel assigned to the United Nations or other multinational peace operations. Like I said, it's the UN, it's Switzerland, foreign hand. Dependents of DoD personnel, family members of DoD civilian employees as defined in Section 040 of Department of State DOS standardized regulations residing with DoD civilian employee outside the United States. This is their usual redefining terms section. Policy includes defensive measures used to reduce the vulnerability of individuals and property to terrorist and other hostile acts. That's, of course, the label with which they will leverage the general U.S. population, reinstituting the constitutional republic. That is what they will call terrorism, and you, as we all know, will be identified as terrorist if you are not completely and obediently allowing foreign enemies to wage war, wreak havoc, and decimate this country and the nation. The country being the land and the nation being the people. If you do not simply lie down and allow them to do that, steal all your stuff, take everything, obligate you into submission and everything else, then you are a terrorist. That's how that works. AT response planning is consistent to the maximum extent possible with the Department of Homeland Security, DHS's National Response Framework and National Incident Management System, and synchronized with incident response plans pursuant to blah, blah, blah. Individuals briefed and indoctrinated for sensitive, compartmented information pursuant to Endowment Community Directive 703. Civilian employees who are designated as emergency essential employees in accordance with blah, blah, blah when necessary to meet expeditionary requirements pursuant to directive type memorandum, and who cares. Responsibilities. Boy, do they love to give themselves broad, quote, responsibilities. Monitors joint DoD component and assessment trends to identify resource and program requirements in coordination with the CJCS, Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller, Chief Financial Officer, Department of Defense, and Director of Defense Threat Reduction Agency. Reflects current DoD FP requirements for defense contractors, including AT and critical information protection, requires prime defense contractors to mandate compliance of all subcontractor tiers with FP-related standards, including AT. Something we need to clarify here is they are building up for large-scale, intentional, knowledgeable, and willful warfare against the U.S. citizen population of this country and abroad, including all uniformed and non-uniformed members of the military forces or any force mechanism which could resist them. That is what they are planning to do here. That is treason. That's the constitutional definition of treason, and that requires effective contesting, right? An effective contest. They can't simply be allowed to just do that. In accordance with Section 26.3, authorities of Volume 1 of the DOS Foreign Affairs Manual subscribe to and monitor Overseas Security Advisory Council information and provide such information to employees overseas. Ensure that U.S. citizen personnel register with the relevant U.S. Embassy and advise their personnel who are third country nationals to contact the appropriate embassy. For Combatant Commander Initiative Fund CCIF, wonder what that is, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict, that's listed here. USDANS, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy Installations and Environment, establishes baseline facility design standards that provide a minimum level of protection suitable for all facilities based on their general cost effectiveness. Here's Director DTRA, maximizes AT threat and vulnerability assessment information sharing among the CCMDs, military services, defense agencies, and DoD field activities. USDPNR, in accordance with DoD blah blah blah, ensures AT enhancements at recruiting facilities and military entrance processing stations located off DoD installations are commensurate with the threat. Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs, that's a nice little title there. USDINS assists the ASD, HD, and HA by providing policy guidance and oversight for security, law enforcement, operations, security, intelligence, and counterintelligence matters related to the DoD AT program. And this stuff is essentially speaking the Empire from Star Wars, right? Monitors National Security Agency, NSA, Central Security Service, National Reconnaissance Office, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, and Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, execution of AT responsibilities to support FP. So that's their designator right there, AT, anti-terrorism, support, force protection, FP. So force protection is going to be your boots on the ground thugs going around holding people up by gunpoint, charging them speeding tickets. I'm just being sarcastic here. Anti-terrorism is the one behind that, right? That's their anti-terrorism. Operates the Defense Counterterrorism Office as lead organization for managing the collection, exploitation, analysis, fusion, coordination, and dissemination of all source intelligence to support DoD AT functions, planning and policy in accordance with its issuance. That's very important for every military component, every military operation, and every military structure to have an intelligence function, a robust intelligence function, because if you don't know where to go, you don't know who to kill, you don't know who to hit, you don't know what to steal, what to destroy, etc., then you can't function appropriately as a military component. There's always some type of intelligence aspect involved. Functions as the DoD intelligence lead for submitting non-signals intelligence, SIGINT data sets to the intelligence community terrorist watch list effort to support blah, blah, blah. Of course, that will be being done against U.S. citizens, as we all know. Develop, maintains, and integrates information technology systems and architecture required by the Defense Intelligence Enterprise to effectively submit international terrorist identity data derived from non-SIGINT DoD databases to the Terrorist Identities Data Mart environment. That's something I'd like to look into a little bit more. The Terrorist Identities Data Mart environment kind of sounds like some type of supermarket, right? A data mart. Serves as the DoD approval authority for DoD nominations, modifications, or removals of non-SIGINT DoD data sets and DoD terrorist watch listing effort. Maintains the recency and validity of DIA terrorist watch list data, ensuring compliance of DoD personnel under the diplomatic security responsibility. It's all garbage coming out of the United Nations because they don't, as far as I'm aware anyway, get any actual consequences to this treason. Provides and conducts security assistance visits and threat assessments for all DIA elements as well as other DoD components under COM diplomatic security responsibility, and provides threat assessments and security assistance visit reports to DoD components, DOS diplomatic security service, senior defense officials, defense attachés, SDOs, DATTs, and COMs. So that's, of course, the cover identity there is the diplomatic security responsibility. Assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Privacy, Civil Liberties, and Transparency, Director NSA/Chief, CSS, disseminates timely SIGINT reports on advisory threats against U.S. interests to the intelligence community and the DoD components. Coordinates SIGINT with the non-DoD law enforcement elements to support force protection. And that is exactly what I just said. So I'll read it again. Coordinates SIGINT, that's signals intelligence, with the non-DoD law enforcement elements to support force protection. The force protection are the quote law enforcement elements, which they are hiding behind. It is a functional system with which they can summon shields to their banner. You know, they put up a banner on the radio, which summons the shields. I mean, that's a really old concept that they're trying to reinvent. You know, the bannerman is the marshal of the king who goes out and summons the bannermen, meaning the shields, to the king to form the army, or to the marshal to form the army, or whatever. DoD component heads coordinate with necessary stakeholders to avoid conflicts between, integrate AT with other FP protection-related programs to deter and mitigate hostile actions against critical information. There are hostile actions against critical information. Submit emergent or emergency AT resource requirements that can not be funded through other means through the appropriate CCDR to the CJCS for CCIF consideration. So it's going to be money laundering, the so-called off-books type stuff. And of course, it's all going to be under the moniker of an emergency, or the cover story. Approved levels of protection based on the Unified Facilities Criteria, UFC, that's some more foreign code garbage. Ensure non-DoD tenants comply with DoD AT requirements. Incorporate AT requirements into contracting processes, implement site-specific AT risk mitigation measures, including access control, screening personnel, transportation and cargo, and AT training. Secretaries of military departments support the CCDRs with physical AORs and exercising tactical control TACCON for FP with their respective AORs, including coordinating intelligence and information sharing to determine necessary protective measures. Employ and integrate unmanned systems in domestic FP activities, including unmanned aircraft systems, in accordance with the October 31st, 2023 Secretary of Defense Memorandum. So yes, that means using drones against U.S. citizens, against local populations, etc. That's exactly what they just said there. Ensure MOUs and MOAs for joint bases. Designate responsibilities for FP-related reporting requirements, including suspicious activity in accordance with blah, blah, blah. Submit emergent or emergency AT resource requirements that cannot be funded through other means to the CJCS through appropriate CCDR or CCIF consideration. CJCS stands for Chair Joint Chiefs. Collaborates with the ASD, HD, and HA to identify AT intelligence, counterintelligence, and information priorities, and to recommend policy and process updates to the USD INS. USD sounds like the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, right? But it's just USD. Combat Commander and Area of Responsibility, CCDRs, stands for Combat Commander. Law enforcement establish AT policies and programs to protect all DoD affiliated personnel within their AORs, except DoD personnel under diplomatic security responsibilities of COMs as designated by the 1997 DOS to DoD MOU and associated MOAs. So yes, that's basically what they're talking about. They're going to use, quote, military assets to protect so-called law enforcement. Of course, they won't really be military. They'll just look to everyone else like they're military, but any veteran or person who's actually been in the military would say, that's not a military guy, that's a moron, right? Joint Task Forces. That's a term we've heard a lot in relation to ATF, DEA, all that Joint Task Force garbage. CCDRs with trans-regional responsibilities ensure subordinate elements that are tenant units on DoD installations coordinate their FP requirements with their respective host commanders and civilian equivalents. Whatever the hell a civilian equivalent is. Stuff's stupid. Then the United States, including its territories and possessions, commanders, and civilian equivalents, pass threat information through the chain of command to the lowest level that has direct liaison with DHS, the Department of Justice, and other federal law enforcement agencies. So that's the primary goal there, and that's the idea of replacing a veteran with first responder. First, they make them equal. They say a first responder is equivalent to a veteran, and then they drop the veteran and keep only first responder. They're just labels. They're just playing the label game. Except when immediate notice is critical to the security of DoD-affiliated personnel, commanders, and DoD civilian equivalents will inform the DOS and U.S. embassies or DHS, the Department of Justice, and other federal law enforcement agencies of the threat information before release to DoD-affiliated personnel. When immediate notice is critical, the security of DoD-affiliated personnel, commanders, and civilian equivalents may immediately disseminate the information to and implement appropriate protective measures for DoD-affiliated personnel. So that's called espionage. TACCON for FP, tactical control. Well, espionage is a word for it anyway. That's the French for SBR, which means just simply to watch. Most people use the term espionage to mean giving information of a particular nature to enemy operations and whatnot. But of course, these are the enemy operations, so they're really just giving the information to their conspirators, collaborators, right? Collaborator used to be a bad word, but it's become in use as common use with this nonsense. It's just something normal. Person subject to TACCON for FP of a CCDR with a physical AOR include active and reserve component personnel on active duty orders, including National Guard personnel in federal service pursuant to blah, blah, blah. Forces or personnel assigned to the United Nations or other multinational peace operations. That's, of course, that thing people were talking about with the so-called invasion of the blue helmets, right? The peacekeeping force invasion of the United States. But, you know, as many people have said, they don't need to send an invasion to the United States. They already have as a mechanism to do it here. They built it up, and they'll just pull it out from the, population or whatnot. CCDR's TACCON for FP does not apply to DoD personnel for whom a COM has security responsibility consistent with 1997 DOS DoD MOU and DoD 5210.84. Chief of Mission is the term for COM, and that sounds like something from the CIA, right? The Central Intelligence Agency loves to have their chiefs of station, and here you've got a chief of mission. The last thing we'll look at here, and then hopefully in the next video I can get into the mineral-related elements, the natural resource, oil, that type of stuff. So this last one is implementation of firearms background check provisions under Section 161A of the Atomic Energy Act of 1954, March 21st, 2017. And of course, the objective behind this, in order to facilitate what we just read, is the reduction of force and protection capabilities of the general population so that they cannot resist this treasonous, unlawful, and tyrannical imposition of a law enforcement designated military occupying force on behalf of foreign interests. Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, acting through its Criminal Justice Information System, CJIS, Division National Instant Background Check System, NICS, U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, NRC. Those are the individuals, quote unquote, involved here. Roles, responsibilities, and functions is the purpose, firearm background checks on armed security personnel of NRC licensees. So this goes beyond simply just the rest of us in the regular population, is like to say, are untrustworthy. We're all criminals and we all have bad intentions, so we all have to have our backgrounds checked by them, by some faceless entity with which we have no say or ability to, well, we could appeal to them, right? But they are the overarching hand with which they can control and determine who gets to carry weapons and who doesn't, obviously contrary to the Second Amendment of the Constitution. But at the same time, it is not simply just that, which is what they always say. We need gun control because there's gun violence everywhere and people are just generally bad and all this stuff. But they actually use it and apply it to what we'll see here. Section 161A of the AEA provides the NRC with new authority that will enhance security at commission-designated facilities and activities of NRC licensees and certificate holders by permitting these NRC licensees and certificate holders to obtain weapons not previously permitted to be owned or possessed under NRC authority. Section 161A also authorizes the official purposes, the preemption of any state, local, and certain federal firearms laws, including regulations that prohibit the transfer, receipt, possession, transport, import, or use of any one or more handguns, rifles, shotguns, short-barrel rifle, machine gun, semi-automatic assault weapon, that's moronic, ammunition for such guns or weapons, or large capacity ammunition, feeding devices, provided that the Commission makes a determined requirement by Section 161A. Fingerprint-based checks are conducted pursuant to a separate arrangement between the NRC and other entity of the FBI CJIS, that's Charlie Juliet India Sierra Division, namely its Biometric Services Section, BSS. That sounds like a bunch of BS to me. The NRC shall submit identifying information received from NRC licensees or certificate holders for security personnel to the FBI for the accomplishment of firearms background checks via the FBI's NICS e-check. This includes both initial and periodic recurring firearm background checks for security personnel or licensees of certificate holders as specified in accordance with the NRC's applicable regulations. That sounds like some more automated junk, some garbage that they can manipulate from any position they would like. Retrieve the results of all NICS transactions via the NICS e-check. Forward the results of the firearms background checks and the associated NICS transaction numbers (NTNs) received via the NICS e-check for the submitting NRC licensee or certificate holder. The submitting NRC licensee or certificate holder will forward to each individual security personnel subject to a firearms background check the results of his or her firearms background check and the associated NTNs. This stuff really makes your blood boil. Monitor the NICS e-check website in order to detect misuse. If misuse is detected, the FBI will forward a warning letter to the Chief FSB and the NRC. Doesn't FSB also stand for something in Russia? Outlining the finding. If further monitoring demonstrates continued misuse, the FBI has the authority to suspend the NRC's NICS privileges. FBI/CGIS per this MOU is not providing NRC with direct access to information in FBI databases. NRC and point of contact, Chief Facilities Security Branch, Division of Facilities and Security, Office of Administration. Director, Division of Physical and Cybersecurity Policy, Office of Nuclear Security and Incident Response. NCIS Management and Program Analyst, NICS Section, FBI Module A-3, 1000 Custer Hollow Road, Clarksburg, West Virginia. Funding and reimbursement. The parties will each fund their respective costs incurred in providing necessary activities required to meet their responsibilities defined in this MOU. Specifically, this MOU does not affect any existing or future agreement between the NRC and FBI through the CJIS BSS regarding the collection and reimbursement to the FBI fees collected from NRC licensees and certificate holders associated with submission and examination of fingerprints against the FBI's database. Parties agree to review this MOU every 3 years. This MOU shall not be construed to provide a right of action for any person or entity against the U.S. its departments, agencies, officers, or employees, approved by Federal Bureau of Investigation. Assistant Director Douglas E. Lindquist, and Nuclear Regulatory Commission is a Director, Cynthia A. Carpenter, Office of Administration. So she's the Director of the Office of Administration. Have to understand the little games they play with their titles. And the first one is dated April 24th, 2017, and the second one is May 17th, 2017. And here we have this particular table right here, which is probably the spreadsheet with which how they carry out this nonsense. Anyway, I suppose that, I believe anyway, with those three elements, we get a perfect evidence-based picture, which all the other paperwork corroborates, by the way, that I've done in my other videos, of what they're exactly planning to do and how they're planning to do it. First, they reduce the force protection capabilities of the U.S. population, which they refuse to recognize to begin with, and turn us into a bunch of lambs to the slaughter type of concept, in coordination with all the nonprofits and religious institutions, all the other idiots that go out there and say weapons are evil and we need to, and the other nonsense I've been hearing, of course, from pastors and religiosity individuals saying stuff like, well, is it the fault of our military personnel that they're sent over to do evil things? And of course, the idea is to insinuate into your mind military personnel and evil, because they're enemies and they coordinate these operations together in many capacities, first psychologically and then physically. So, to sum it up, their plan is to reduce the amount of capabilities of individuals, put it into the hands of private corporate ownership, exchange military for law enforcement, private law enforcement, effectively speaking, and take over the country and put anyone who who resists them in places like Guantanamo Bay, which used to be reserved for enemies of the United States, apparently. Now they're going to be reserved for us, enemies of the globalist United Nations treason. That is what they plan to do. They want to be able to take people from the United States who say, we are not going to allow you to steal and harvest our children. We are not going to allow you to monopolize the land, housing, natural resources, all that stuff. And if you refuse to accept that, we will force you to accept it with force, with arms. And those individuals, they want to be able to subdue and place into Guantanamo Bay to be tortured and otherwise dealt with as they see fit, because they are vindictive, evil, and nasty enemy operatives engaged in overt treason and in coordination with the majority of so-called local, state, county, and quote-unquote federal agencies, but which are basically just attorneys hiding under false covers. And the most important of all, religious institutions. Religious institutions are really finally involved in this garbage. They have to be approached as an enemy occupation, because that's really what they are. Thank you.